John Spoonfed said this. John Spoonfed Dean. Strange how they didn't preserve the early Bible nor the Quran. Is that because the books were not important or created at the time or the prophets? The messenger delivers the basic guidelines, and then hundreds of years later, politics jumps in and branding and develops books. YK made this point. My point is that you show 4th century AD Bibles the same way that there are 4th or 5th century AH, that means after Hijrah, Qurans. What you allude to is that since the cult of Muhammad is about 600 years younger than that of Christ, the later should be judged by higher standards. The later meaning the Islamic or the Quranic manuscript should be judged by a higher standard. Pub Lunch says it this way. An issue is that Jay says the New Testament written down within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus, yet the earliest manuscripts are from 300 years later. Isn't that the same as the oldest manuscripts for the Quran? Valid point. Absolutely. Valid point. The difficulty that most of you are coming up with is that you cannot really compare the two because we have completely two different categories. See, the earliest biblical manuscripts were written on papyrus. So what are papyrus? Well, let's take a look and see. You can see this picture of papyrus leaves. Those are papyrus leaves. And here I'm just going to show you what happens, what you do with the papyrus leaves. You can see this is an ancient example of in Egypt where the papyri where mostly came from and where they used to this for thousands of years. They would cut off the papyrus plant and then they would strip it down into strips which they would lay on a platform. Then they would wet it and then they would interweave it like a weaving mat, and then they would pound it out, and the sap from the papyrus leaves would interlock with each other, and that would create a flat surface, and then they would put a cover over top of it to hold it in place with weight, and then after a few days they would just take it off, and there you have your papyrus. It's very simple. Nothing hard, and it's also very cheap. Anybody can make papyrus. And the oldest manuscripts or the oldest paper of the Bible was written on that. Why? Because it was a poor man's paper. Anybody could make it. All you need are papyrus stalks, and you can then understand why it was very simple then to make it, regardless of where you are. It was very simple to make it. So when you look around the world and you ask, well, where are these papyri? Here, let me give you some examples. So the earliest papyri for the Bible are John Rylands P52. Here's a picture of it. The John Rylands is from Manchester in England. It's from the 1st century. Some would say between 100 to 150. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 31 to 33, and also verses 37 to 38, front and back. Just a small fragment. Here's another one, Bodmer Papyrus, which is in Geneva. The Bodmer Papyrus, the P66, it's from 200 AD. It's housed there in Geneva in Rome, and it has fragments of the Gospel of Luke. Also, it has the Lord's Prayer, and it also has fragments of the Gospel of John from 200 AD. Here's another example, the Chester Beatty. Now, the Chester Beatty has many of these fragments. Here's one of P46, which is from the Pauline epistles. Many of the Pauline epistles are represented in these fragments from 200 AD again. There are 85 folios from the Chester Beatty fragments. And they are kept in Dublin, in Ireland, and also in the University of Michigan here in the United States. And the last one I'm going to show you here is Oxyrhynchus. The Oxyrhynchus fragments probably are of almost 41% of all biblical fragments, papyrus fragments, have been found there in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, which is just outside of the city of Oxyrhynchus. It was in a pit used for rubbish. It was a rubbish pit, and they have come across these since the 1800s. I think only 1 to 2% of these have even yet been deciphered, because we're talking about millions of fragments, many of them just the size of a piece of cornflake. But here you can see the P1. This is one of the earliest that were found. It's from 200 AD. It's been dated 200 AD. It includes Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 9, and also verses 13 to 20 on the backside. And it's housed in the University of Pennsylvania. Papyrus, as you can see, when you look at these are very fragile. That's the problem with papyrus. Because they're made out of leaves, because that they're interlocking leaves, because they are hammered and then wetted and then dried and then used, after a while, they just start to disintegrate. They just become dry. If you're in a wet climate, they even disintegrate faster. If you're in a dry climate, they stay a little bit longer. In fact, one of the reasons why the papyrus that we have for the Dead Sea Scrolls lasted, well, those were from the first century BC. That's over 2,000 years they lasted, because they were in a very dry climate in those jars there in the Dead Sea, just above the Dead Sea. But the biblical manuscripts, the New Testament manuscripts we're talking about, Dead Sea Scroll would be Old Testament. New Testament manuscripts, these fragments that you see are just that. They're just fragments. The reason why, because with papyrus, they disintegrate very quickly. They only last about 100 years before they start to disintegrate. So we would not expect to find any biblical manuscripts, complete ones, that have lasted 2,000 years. The ones that have lasted, and the fragments that have lasted, were thrown away, pieces that were thrown away. Remember, the Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD destroyed most of the biblical manuscripts that existed. They went around and just collected thousands upon tens of thousands of Bibles and just burned them. So we don't have full manuscripts anymore because of the Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD. That which we do have are ones that no one paid attention to, and because they are fragments, no one really cared about them, and that's why they still exist today, and that's why they're in different libraries all over the Western world. Papyri, by definition, is a poor man's paper. Disintegrates easily. Almost all of our earliest documents were written on papyri because the church was very poor. The church did not control anything. The church was under persecution for 300 years until the 4th century. The church was always under persecution, and being under persecution, they did not have the freedoms, nor did they have the wealth to be able to afford parchment. Parchment are not leaves. These have nothing to do with interlocking leaves. And so that's why you don't find parchments any earlier than the 4th century. Why the 4th century? Well, here's the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Vaticanus that I've shown before. Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and the Sinaiticus, or whichever way you want to put them. But let's look at the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, the two on the left and in the center there. Those are the earliest of the full manuscripts. Now notice those are written on parchment. Parchment are animal skins. By definition, animal skins. Let's look and see what happens with parchment. When you look at parchment here you can see what you have to do. To make parchment is much, much more sophisticated, much, much more expensive. Here you see the skins are being dehaired. In order to dehair them, you've got to put them in a type of liquid made up of alkaline, and it takes days, sometimes weeks, to get all the hair off them. So that's the first problem. And then you have to dry them on frames. Here you can see skin drying. That's parchment, and they have to be pulled, and you have to keep them. And then you while they are drying there, you would rub them with stones to smooth out or get out all whatever hair is remaining. And then on the flesh side of the skin, which would be the inner side of the skin, you then would rub what we call pumice powder. And here you can see an example of pumice powder to make it much smoother. So this would take an enormous amount of labor, an enormous amount of work, and that's why only very wealthy individuals would be able to use or to take parchments. The Sinaiticus, this one here that you see in the middle, this one, the Sinaiticus, we know took about anywhere from 50 to 60 gazelle skins. This is deer skins. Anywhere from 50 to 60 gazelle skins had to be cured that way that I just showed you. It would take weeks, months, and you would then have to put them together to create the codice known as the Sinaiticus. Only someone very wealthy could afford something of that expensive. And that's why when Constantine, who was the emperor in the 4th century, when he converted to Christianity, when he commissioned the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, he commissioned, we understand, quite a number of these codices, these books to be made of the New Testament. so that Athanasius could argue against Arius on whether or not Jesus was God. And so these books were commissioned at that time. This Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, these two that you see here, are possibly two of those codices that were commissioned at that time. We don't know, because we don't know how many of them were finished. We just know that this is what the intent was. But those would have been commissioned by Constantine, who was very wealthy, being emperor of the entire empire at that time. He could therefore afford parchment. That's why it would be nothing for him to commission books written out of parchment. But that only began in the 4th century. So from the 4th century on, then, of course, parchment became very popular amongst the monks and, of course, amongst the church, which was very wealthy. We then come to the 7th century, and this is when Islam came to the fore. This is what we've been told. And what we're told is that immediately after the death of Muhammad in 632, you then get the first codex that was commissioned by a caliph. A caliph is a king. Caliph Abu Bakr between 632 and 634. So as a king who was there in Medina, according to the traditions, this is what the traditions tell us, he would have been wealthy, and he would have been able to, therefore, afford parchment. He would not need papyrus, and that's why when he commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit to write out the first Quran, that would have been on parchment. 20 years later, 652, when Uthman then has Zayd ibn Thabit again write a second Quran, that's known as the Uthmanic recension. By that time, he controlled all the way from Tripoli all the way to Afghanistan. All that land was under his control, according to the tradition. I'm always going to say that, according to the traditions. So he would have been enormously wealthy. He would have never used papyrus, and there's no reason for any caliph of his note to have used papyrus, so he would have used parchment again. So that earliest manuscript by Abu Bakr would have been in parchment. So would the one in 652. That would have been in parchment. And the 5 copies he made to the 5 cities would have all been on parchment. Some say, well, what about vellum? Vellum is actually another form. It's similar to parchment, but it comes from calves, much, much younger, and therefore they have much nicer, finer skin. And that's why they are very, very, very expensive. I don't know whether these were made on vellum. We're not told. What we are told is that these codices were created. And that's why the first Quran would have been written on these codices, written on parchment. What we do know is that the earliest manuscripts that have come down to us, that are still extant today, like the Topkapi, which is there in Istanbul, in the Topkapi Museum, like the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, like the one that is in the British Library, the Matyil, the 2165 manuscript, or the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in Paris, in France, or the Husseini manuscript, which is there in Cairo, in Egypt, or even the Sana'a manuscript, which was discovered in the 1970s there in Sana'a, in Yemen. All of these 6 major manuscripts, which are available. I have the Topkapi right here. That's it right up there. There's the Topkapi. The Topkapi, all of these would have been written and are written on parchment. They're not written on papyrus. They were all written on animal skins. Animal skins are durable. All of these manuscripts continue till today. The Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus are still available. They're still pristine. You can go to the British Library, go to the Bridbach Gallery, and you can see the Sinaiticus. It's almost as nice today as the day it was made because it's made on animal skin. That's why the question I'm asking is perfectly relevant. Where are these 5 parchments of Uthman? 5 of them, sent to 5 different cities, written on animal skins, not on papyrus. You can't ask the same question of the earliest biblical manuscripts because papyrus would have disintegrated within 100 years. That's why we only have little bits and bits and bits of fragments, but we have so many, tens of thousands of them, that we can piece them together. And by the 4th century then, when Constantine was able then to, with his will, to then commission these manuscripts like the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, later on the Alexandrinus, which comes in the 5th century, those are all written on parchment, on animal skin. If we could come up with 3 complete manuscripts of the New Testament by the 5th century, where in the world are these 5 manuscripts, parchment manuscripts, written by Uthman, commissioned by Uthman, and sent to 5 cities? I just want one. I just want one. So don't get upset with me when you think I'm actually not being consistent. I am being consistent, but you need to understand the technology that was used to create the earliest biblical script manuscripts did not include parchment. All they had, because they were poor, were papyrus. That excuse, Muslims, you can't make, because all of your manuscripts were created by caliphs, and none of them were created by poor people. They were all created by people who were enormously wealthy, and the earliest manuscripts we have today are all on parchment. Therefore, there is no excuse for you not to have these parchments today, because those parchments last for hundreds, thousands of years. Well, maybe I shouldn't say thousands, but at least we know that the ones that we have for the biblical manuscripts are now 1,700 years old, coming up onto 2,000 years. There are parchments that go all the way back. There are parchments in museums from Greek poetry that go right back to the time long before Christ, hundreds of years before Christ, and that's almost like 2,400 to 2,500 years ago, and they're still pristine today. You have no excuse not to have your parchments. Where are your parchments? That's all I'm asking. I would just like one of the five. One of the five. And please stop showing me the Topkapi or the Samarkand or the Ma'il or the Husseini. I don't want to look at those, because those are all 8th and 9th century. We haven't even got into the manuscript evidence. I don't want you to keep pushing those, or even the Birmingham folios, those two pages that you keep on throwing at me and say, listen, that shows that they're from the 7th century. We're going to confront all of that later on. But can you understand why I'm asking this question? Can you understand why I'm not being inconsistent? Can you now understand why the Muslims are so fearful? Because there's no excuse for them not to have these manuscripts. There's no excuse for them not being able to trace back this book. 1,700 years, that's not very long ago. Not for parchment, not for vellum. For papyrus, yes. So we would not expect to have the papyrus for our New Testament. Not today. You can't make that excuse. God bless you. This has been Jay. Over and out.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you some of the oldest Bible manuscripts discovered so far. In my series on Who Wrote the Bible, I talked a lot about when each book of the Bible was written. However, keep in mind that in no case do we have the original versions of those books. What we have instead are manuscripts, which are copies or copies of copies, that usually date to hundreds of years after the originals. So, how old are the manuscripts that we have, and how reliable are they? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But first, let me tell you about our sponsor, MyHeritage. If you want to learn more about your family's history, MyHeritage is currently offering a 14-day free trial followed by a 50% discount. Just use the link in the description or pinned comment. One of the best things about MyHeritage is that it gives you access to over 16 billion records. That includes primary sources like birth certificates, military records, and newspaper articles. And MyHeritage automatically finds these documents as you build your tree. One of the documents that I found is this page from the 1871 Census of Canada, taken just 4 years after Canada became a country. On it is listed my great-great-grandparents, Jacob and Lucy Baker, as well as my great-grandfather, Gabriel Baker, who was only 9 years old at the time. From this record, I learned that they were Baptists, that they were of German descent, and that Jacob worked as a fisherman and farmer. My wife found this record from Ellis Island, dated July 18th, 1903. It lists the passengers who arrived in New York from Antwerp on a ship named the Kroonland. Number 26 on the list is her great-grandfather, Yitzhak Yosvein. The document shows that he was Jewish, that he came from the Russian Empire, and that he arrived with $7.50. If you'd like to discover similar records about your own family, just click the link in the description or pinned comment to start a free trial at MyHeritage right now. Okay, back to the oldest Bible manuscripts. I'm going to be talking about them in the form of a top 10 countdown. So coming in at number 10 is the Masoretic text, represented by two very important manuscripts, Codex Aleppo and Codex Leningradensis. Up until 1947, Codex Aleppo was the oldest complete copy of the Tanakh in Hebrew, which is what Christians call the Old Testament. So originally, it included the complete Torah, the prophets, and the writings. For many centuries, this manuscript was kept at the Central Synagogue in Aleppo, Syria. However, in 1947, during anti-Jewish riots, it went missing. It resurfaced about a decade later in Israel, but when it did, only 60% of the manuscript remained. That surviving 60% is now located in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. It dates to around the year 920 CE and was created by a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes, hence the name the Masoretic text. But since the Aleppo Codex is no longer complete, the oldest complete copy of the Masoretic text is now Codex Leningradensis, located in St. Petersburg, Russia, which was formerly known as Leningrad. The Leningrad Codex dates to the year 1008, so not quite as old as the Aleppo Codex, but still more than 1,000 years old. However, as we learned in the Who Wrote the Bible series, most of the Tanakh was written between the years 650 and 350 BCE, which means that the Leningrad Codex is actually closer in time to us today than it is to the original authors of its content. Now, please note that the Masoretic text is not the oldest copy of the Tanakh. It's the oldest complete copy in the original Hebrew. The Septuagint, which is older, is also a complete copy of the Tanakh, but it's written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And then, of course, there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are even older. They are written in Hebrew, but they are not complete. So if we're looking for the oldest complete copy of the Tanakh, or Old Testament, in Hebrew, that would be the Masoretic text, represented nowadays by Codex Leningradensis. This is the text that provides the foundation for the Old Testament section in every modern translation of the Bible. Okay, coming in at number 9 are the four great uncials: Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. These four manuscripts were created by early Christians and thus contain both the Old Testament written in Greek, known as the Septuagint, or LXX for short, as well as the New Testament, including the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Pauline epistles, and the other New Testament books. All, of course, are written in Greek, and some also include several apocryphal books. So basically, these four manuscripts are the only four copies of the complete Bible that have survived from ancient times. They are called uncials because they are written in uppercase letters. Of the four, Codex Vaticanus is probably the oldest, dating to around 325 CE. It gets its name from the fact that it has been kept at the Vatican since the 1440s. Nowadays, however, anyone in the world can view it using the Vatican's online digital library. I'll leave a link to it in the description. The next oldest of the four is Codex Sinaiticus, dating to around 350 CE. It was rediscovered in 1844 at a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, but is now primarily housed at the British Library in London. You can view this one online too. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. The other two, Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, were both likely created in Alexandria, Egypt, during the early 400s CE. but both eventually wound up in Constantinople. However, from there, they wound up in the hands of the British and the French, respectively, and thus today can be found in London and Paris. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Old Testament portions of these manuscripts are actually quite a bit older than the Masoretic text. However, they are written in Greek, which means that they are actually translations of the original Hebrew. The Greek version is called the Septuagint, or LXX, because the original Torah portion was said to have been translated by 70 Jewish scribes back in the Ptolemaic period. Now, when the Greek Septuagint is compared to the Hebrew Masoretic text, there are some minor differences. This has led to some debate over which one is closer to the original. On the one hand, the Septuagint manuscripts are much older, but on the other hand, they are not in the original Hebrew. Generally speaking, the Masoretic text is seen as being the more authoritative one, with differences from the Septuagint being mentioned in the footnotes in many modern translations. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, the 4 great unseals represent the oldest complete versions of all 27 books put together. However, as we're about to see, when it comes to each individual book, we do have versions that are even older. Thus, when it comes to the standard Greek text that is used as the foundation for most modern translations, none of these codices are used alone in the same way that Codex Leningradensis is for the Old Testament. Instead, most scholars today use what's called the Nestle-Aland text, which is a version of the Greek New Testament made about 100 years ago by comparing all the various manuscripts available and figuring out what the original text was most likely to be. Okay, moving along to number 8, the Bodmer Papyri. This is a collection of many manuscripts purchased in 1931 in Egypt by an antiquities collector named Martin Bodmer. Included in this set are P66, an almost complete copy of the Gospel of John, and P75, an almost complete copy of Luke, as well as half of John. Both date to the early 200s CE, making them at least 100 years older than the versions of the Gospels included in the 4 great unseals. So these 2 Bodmer papyri in particular are notable in that they represent the oldest, mostly complete copies of a Gospel. Nowadays, P66 is located in Switzerland and P75 is at the Vatican. Also included in the Bodmer papyri is a good portion of the Book of Psalms in Greek, as well as 1st and 2nd Peter, several apocryphal books, and even a bit of Homer's Iliad. Coming in at number 7 is another large collection of manuscripts known as the Chester Beatty Papyri, named yet again after a collector of antiquities. Most of these were also rediscovered in Egypt, but in this case they were brought to Dublin, Ireland, where they are housed to this day, although a few key pages ended up at the University of Michigan. Included in the Chester Beatty collection is a manuscript called P46, which is around the same age as the 2 Bodmer manuscripts I mentioned. However, in this case, P46 represents the oldest, mostly complete copy we have of the Pauline epistles. The collection also includes partial copies of other books, both from the Septuagint and the New Testament. Number 6 is the Magdalene fragments, also known as P64 and P67. These are all tiny pieces from a now lost copy of the Gospel of Matthew. They were found in Egypt in 1901, but are now located at Magdalene College in Oxford, hence their name. It is possible that these fragments are even older than the oldest manuscripts in the Bodmer and Chester Beatty collections. At one point, they were even thought to perhaps date all the way to the 1st century. However, most scholars now place them in the 2nd century, if not the 3rd. At number 5, we have the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, a massive collection of manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1898. They are named after the city of Oxyrhynchus, where they were found, which was once the third largest city in Egypt. 90% of the documents were actually stuff that most of us would find quite boring, like census returns and tax assessments. But there were also texts from famous Greek writers such as Sophocles, Sappho, Euripides, and even Aristotle. And of course, there were bits and pieces from the Greek Bible. Most important are P90, a section from John, and P104, a section from Matthew. These both date to around 150 CE and are thus the second and third earliest New Testament fragments found so far. The earliest New Testament fragment comes in at number 4. It's known as the Rylands Papyrus, or P52. It dates perhaps as early as 125 CE, which means that it was maybe created a mere 30 years after the original. It's pretty small though, containing only a few lines from John chapter 18 on each side. It was found in Egypt in 1920 and is currently on display at the University of Manchester. Okay, this means that we're now finished with the New Testament. Therefore, the top 3 manuscripts are all going to be Hebrew documents that contain portions of the Old Testament, or Tanakh. Number 3 is the Nash Papyrus, found in 1902, once again in Egypt. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nash Papyrus was the oldest fragment we had of the Hebrew Bible, dating to around 150 BCE. However, the Nash Papyrus only contains a very small portion of the Torah, mostly just the 10 Commandments and the Shema prayer. It's now located at Cambridge University. Okay, we now come to a biggie, the Dead Sea Scrolls, famously discovered in 1946 at Qumran, arguably one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. Loads of documents were found, ranging in dates from 300 BCE to 100 CE. There were portions or fragments from every part of the Tanakh except for the Book of Esther. Most notable was a mostly intact, near-complete scroll of the Book of Isaiah. But there were also several apocryphal books found, as well as documents relating to the Jewish community that lived at Qumran. So the main thing you need to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they're not some sort of alternative Bible. They are simply copies of the Bible that we already had, as well as some copies of some non-biblical writings. And the important thing is that they actually confirm that the copy of the Hebrew Bible we have today is pretty much the same as the copy of the Hebrew Bible that was around during the time of Jesus. Remember how I mentioned earlier that prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest version of the Tanakh that we had in Hebrew was the Masoretic text, which dates much later to around 1000 CE. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text pretty much line up perfectly, meaning that although 1000 years passed between them, the scribes actually did a very good job at copying things accurately. Sure, there are some minor differences, mostly variations in spelling, shown here in green, but there are no examples where an entire story was changed in some dramatic way. This screenshot here is actually from a great website called dssenglishbible.com. I'll link to that in the description. It shows you exactly what the differences are between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text, the red words being the ones that are slightly different. Okay, so what could be older than the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, coming in at number 1, representing the oldest text of the Bible ever found, is the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls. Notice that I had to extend the timescale so that I could fit their estimated date of 650 BCE on there. Now, these are not actually manuscripts per se. They are tiny amulets of rolled silver, but on them are inscribed letters written in a very old Hebrew script that match the text of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. This passage is known as the priestly blessing, and it is still used in Jewish synagogues today, which is cool because we know that these words are at least 2,650 years old, being the only words from the entire Bible that can be archaeologically placed prior to the destruction of the first temple. And here's another cool fact about the priestly blessing. When a member of the Kohanim, who are thought to be the descendants of the original Jewish priests, says this blessing, they hold their hands like this. A certain Jew by the name of Leonard Nimoy remembered seeing this as a kid, and it served as the inspiration for what has become known as the Vulcan salute. So basically, the Ketef Hinnom scrolls are a 2,600-year-old version of Live Long and Prosper. Okay, now that I have introduced you to some of the oldest Bible manuscripts, I'd like to end by discussing what it all means when it comes to the historical method. Supposedly, the famous Christian evangelist Billy Graham once said that there is more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead than there is that Julius Caesar ever lived. This is an idea that continues to be floated by some Christians today. And in fact, it even comes up in the comments on this channel every now and then. The argument usually involves a chart that looks something like this. We see listed here several works of ancient literature, including that of the New Testament. It then lists two key pieces of information. The first is the amount of time between when the work was written and the earliest manuscript we have of that work. So, for example, the chart tells us that the gap for Tacitus is 750 years, but the gap for the New Testament is only 30 years. Secondly, the chart lists the total number of manuscripts we have for each piece of writing. So again, according to this chart, we have only 36 manuscripts for Tacitus, but we have a whopping 5,856 for the New Testament. Now, there are three major problems with this chart. The first is that it is extremely misleading. At first glance, one might assume that we have close to 6,000 complete manuscripts of the New Testament, all of which date close to 30 years after they were written. If this were true, it would indeed be pretty impressive, but it's not. Let me show you a different chart. So far, the number of manuscripts we have from the first century, which is when Jesus lived and when most of the New Testament was written, is 0. And from the second century, we have a grand total of 4. And all of those are extremely small fragments. I mentioned 3 of them in this video, the oldest being the Rylands Papyrus. Now, it is in fact true that the Rylands Papyrus might date to a mere 30 years after the original. But keep in mind that the Rylands Papyrus is by no means a complete copy of the New Testament. It's just a tiny piece of paper with a few lines on it, as are all the other 2nd century manuscripts. When we get to the 3rd century, the number of manuscripts goes up to around 50. And here we get for the first time a few that contain complete books, such as the Pauline epistles from the Chester Beatty collection and the Gospels of Luke and John from the Bodmer collection. However, the vast majority of those 50 are still very small fragments. Moving on to the 4th and 5th centuries, the number of manuscripts goes up to around 100, and it is here that we get the 4 great uncials, the only 4 complete New Testaments in Greek that have survived from ancient times. Everything else is just fragments or partial manuscripts. We then get another 350 or so from 500 to 1000 CE, meaning that the vast majority of that 5,856 number comes from after the year 1000. So this certainly paints a bit of a different picture. But my second point is that from the perspective of the historical method, the total number of manuscripts is not really all that important. Christianity has been the dominant religion in Europe for the last 2,000 years, so it's not surprising that there are a lot of copies of its most important text. What's more important to a historian is whether or not a manuscript is authentic, and there are a variety of ways to determine this, beyond just counting the number of copies we have. In fact, so long as we have just one complete manuscript that we can somehow determine is authentic, that's all we really need. Everything else is just gravy. Finally, from the perspective of the historical method, the size of the gap between when the text was written and the oldest manuscript we have of that text is also not as important as you might think. What's more important than the age of the manuscript is the age of the writing itself and the genre in which it was written. Like I said, historians have several methods for dating texts, one of which involves linguistic analysis. So, in other words, if we have just one copy of an authentic text that we can be certain was written by Julius Caesar himself, it doesn't really matter whether that manuscript is 100 years old or 1,000 years old. 100 years old would be nice, but so long as we can use other methods to determine that Julius Caesar actually wrote it, the 1,000-year-old copy will do. So for example, we have 251 copies of the Gallic Wars, written by Julius Caesar, the earliest of which dates to about 850 years after the original. This work of literature was written by Caesar himself, perhaps with the assistance of a scribe, and it is based on Caesar's own eyewitness account of the fight between the Romans and the Gauls. Sure, it might involve some exaggeration and propaganda, but generally speaking, it's a relatively straightforward non-fiction account of what happened. Contrast this with the four Gospels, which were not actually written by Jesus himself. Sure, they most likely do contain some of the actual words of Jesus, but remember, these would have been translated from the original Aramaic to Greek, and each Gospel as a whole was written by an author who was likely writing 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, and who was trying to make certain theological points, rather than simply record a series of events. So if I had to place a wager on who was more likely to have been a real historical person, I'd place my bet on Caesar. Of course, such a forced choice is not actually necessary. I firmly believe, as do most historians, that both Caesar and Jesus were real historical people. Now, as to whether or not the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus is 100% accurate, well, that's another question. But the point is, we have good evidence for the existence of both people. So that was a look at some of the oldest Bible manuscripts found so far, and what those manuscripts mean from a historical point of view. If you think that there's a manuscript that I should have mentioned but did not, be sure to leave a comment. Thanks for watching.